Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The FAA has been working to update its aging air traffic control system literally for decades now. But 2026 is looking to be a big year on the FAA modernization front. The One Big Beautiful Bill Congress passed earlier this year puts more than $12 billion towards air traffic control modernization. And the FAA's new administrator expects to obligate about half of that by the end of this fiscal year. Federal News Network's Serbu has an update on the agency's modernization plans and how they've changed under the new administration.
The FAA is on an aggressive schedule to completely replace the air traffic control system within the next 3 years. But the billions of dollars in reconciliation funding targeted for expenditure in fiscal 2026 is meant to lay the foundation for that long-term plan. The agency says it's using the funds to modernize its telecommunications and air surveillance systems, including by replacing aging copper circuits with fiber optics. Brian Bedford is the FAA's administrator.
When we talk about modernizing telco, most people think about moving from copper to fiber, going, from analog to digital. And that's all true, but there's another element of modernization that we aren't doing today. The second round of funding that we're asking for will be critical to get that done, and that is essentially to re-architect how the fiber is laid. So, for example, Dallas-Fort Worth, we had a significant outage, our TRACON there. That system theoretically was modernized, but the architecture of that system had not been modernized. So there's really a two-step process here. So even in places where we're replacing copper with fiber, I just want to be transparent that there's still another step that has to happen to get from analog to digital, which will drive the resilience and our capabilities to increase bandwidth in our facilities. So it's an important distinction.
Bedford testifying this month before the Senate Commerce Committee. He told lawmakers the telco modernization work is now about 35% complete, and that portion of the overall project should be finished by the third quarter of fiscal 2027. But to complete all the work the agency thinks will need to happen in order to fully modernize the system, officials say they'll need another $20 billion on top of the $12.5 billion they refer to as a down payment. And to manage the overall project, earlier this month, the FAA hired Peraton to serve as the prime integrator for the new system. In order to meet that 3-year target, Bedford says the agency built in specific incentives to reward performance and on-time delivery across 14 areas the FAA has identified as critical needs.
We set up a series of needs packages that clearly articulate what the work streams are and the estimated timeline to completion. Peraton's profit, if we want to think about that, is essentially broken into 3 different elements. There's a fixed profit element of 3%, and then there's a variable profitable element of 6%. The 6% variable profitability element is contingent upon completing the plan on budget and on time with our satisfaction. And we will hold back 3% of the potential profits for any potential damages that might happen for failure to comply with our work packages. So it's a very strenuous agreement, and we have vigilant oversight on it.
Meanwhile, the agency says it will also need additional funding to keep the current system up and running while the new one is being built. The Government Accountability Office has identified 105 individual components of the overall system that it's deemed unsustainable, as those subsystems, many of them decades old, continue to age. So, as Bedford says, the $5 billion in annual modernization funding Congress is considering as part of the standard appropriations process is more about operating and sustaining those legacy systems than modernizing them.
I believe as you read many of these audit reports, you would learn the same thing that I have, which is 80% of our infrastructure is considered obsolete and or unsustainable. Of course, the vast majority of that $5 billion doesn't actually go to build new brick and mortar. 85 to 90% of those funds actually go to sustaining, repairing, painting, replacing elevators and HVAC systems and plumbing and roofs. I mean, frankly, we're putting lipstick on a pig. So you may think you're buying brand new infrastructure with the $5 billion, but what you're buying is sustainment of the old system.
The overall modernization project is broken down into 5 categories: communications, surveillance, automation, facilities, and broad updates across the state of Alaska. Senator Tammy Duckworth, the ranking Democrat on the Transportation Subcommittee on Aviation, Space, and Innovation, says there needs to be one more: workforce.
We must remember that the recent aviation safety crisis was driven by decades of FAA pouring billions into unproven technologies and costly service contracts as it pursued in vain modernization projects with overly ambitious goals and constantly changing requirements. These shiny objects lured FAA into neglecting the health, capabilities, and capacity of our AT system's most important assets, its people. Under presidents of both parties and across multiple Congresses, ATC shed critical expertise and experience, and between 2013 and 2023, FAA only hired 2/3 of the controllers that FAA's own staffing model called for. So today, we find ourselves short 3,500 air traffic controllers, while air travel rises to record highs and controllers are forced to regularly work 60-hour weeks because well over 90% of airports are understaffed. Placing the lives of our constituents in the hands of civil servants who are overworked and utterly exhausted was and remains unfair, unacceptable, and ultimately dangerous.
Bedford says the agency is taking workforce issues seriously under a separate initiative called Flight Plan 2026. He says the FAA has plans to hire 8,900 new controllers between now and 2028, but the recent government shutdown didn't help matters. An estimated 500 people withdrew from the FAA's controller training program while they were waiting for the shutdown to end. And for controllers already on the job, staffing shortages caused an unprecedented number of safety-related air traffic slowdowns.
Staffing triggers reached unprecedented levels, rising from mere single digits prior to the lapse to more than 80 in a single day. Applying the hard lessons we've learned from the DCA accident, the FAA safety team identified controller workload and system demand as emerging risk factors. And as a response to this increased risk, we temporarily reduced operations at 40 high-traffic airports. The connection between controller workload, system demand, and operational risk was unmistakable, and it reinforced the need for the FAA to act decisively when the data demanded it, and underscored the importance of stable controller funding.
Jared Serbu, Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.
You can find Jared's story at federalnewsnetwork.com.
Sean O'Keefe, former Navy Secretary, NASA Administrator, and senior leader across multiple presidential administrations, reflects on the principles that shaped his long federal career. In this episode of Lessons in Leadership, he joined Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, to discuss motivating teams through uncertainty, leading across agencies, and staying rooted in mission during times of public scrutiny and change.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Sean O'Keefe, former NASA Administrator, former Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, former Secretary of the Navy, former Comptroller and CFO of the Defense Department, and Professor Emeritus at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Public Affairs. Welcome, and thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Shane. Delight to be with you. Appreciate it very much.
What first drew you into public service, and when was it evident to you that leadership was an important part of the roles you played?
Well, I grew up around the public service. My dad was a career naval officer. He was a submariner, and we lived all over the place throughout the country. And as a result, I got an up-close and personal understanding through him, as well as through all the folks he associated with and the environments he was working in, just what the extraordinary value is of public service and what is it that would motivate people to want to be engaged in it and to be really involving themselves in what is something larger than themselves. And the only place that is really formulated properly is within the public sector and the public service. That again is the beneficiary or the beneficiaries are the citizens of the nation, the community, and the region in which you live.
Did you think about leadership early on, saying, I need to be a great leader and therefore I'm going to learn how to do it, or did you just naturally evolve into it? Any thoughts on that?
I guess it evolved by the great good fortune of being witness to several really extraordinary leaders, people who really did take the initiative to engage others in the task, to pull together and motivate folks to really contribute their very best to achieve an outcome. And I saw the value of that on multiple occasions and found that was the primary ingredient, the trait, the characteristic that needed to be exhibited is the fundamentals of leadership in moving everyone engaged towards a common objective.
You have served under several presidents. Can you talk a little bit about that? What were there challenges to overcome, or were you away from politics so you didn't get? Talk about that a little bit. How does it differ as you serve through a transition, or does leadership stay the same?
Oh no, it's it's really critically important in transition cases, to be sure. But the two presidents that I served in their administrations were President George H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush in two different eras, obviously. But as a consequence, that was the closest I came to understanding the nature of the individuals who were in that ultimate leadership capacity, and their capability to motivate. Both of them were just extraordinarily inspiring people who motivated everybody to be part of the solution. But most importantly, they also had a capacity of really designating what needed to be done. And you knew that they were perfectly prepared to do it themselves. And that made the task that much more achievable. There were several different circumstances in understanding what the objectives of the senior leadership are all about.
You've worked for different kinds of organizations, political administrations, and then government departments, agencies, and then private sector, and now academia. How does that affect your leadership style? Or do you find that leadership, the core tenets of leadership, are applicable no matter what the organization you find yourself in and having to lead? It doesn't matter where you are, that the core leadership characteristics are the same? Are they different? Are you adapting?
Well, there's a common myth in my judgment, and I'm probably the minority view of this in the academic field of public management. That common myth is that you can't apply the same principles in the public sector that you do in the private sector.
Yeah.
I never found that to be an impediment.
Okay.
It was always a circumstance where, strategy, the focus on the talent, people engaged, the process to going through decision making, the integrity imperative that must be there in order to demonstrate the absolute conviction of what's intended here, as well as the moral standing of what it is you're attempting to achieve. All those factors are very much the same. It's going to have its nuances, and there are very distinctive, differentiators within those organizations and those sectors. But at the same time, those basic principles, those tenets, foundations of what make up organizations and organization theory, in so many ways are fundamentally the same. And how you employ those may be slightly nuanced to match the condition, but they all are imperative in the same direction.
A little bit of a different direction. You were part of the very first cohort of what is now Presidential Management Intern Program, later became the Presidential Management Fellows Program. What did that early experience teach you about leading within government?
The Presidential Management Intern Program, as it started, was designed for just that purpose, a focus on public management, a focus on implementation. And its evolution over time has been extraordinary. It mystifies me why that has been the subject now of an executive order that has dismantled it. And it's It's absolutely unconscionable given the nature of the hundreds, thousands of people who moved through that program in the course of the last nearly 50 years that have gone on in some cases to be senior executives within the federal government, and in other cases, they've moved on to other kinds of pursuits. But even with that, even for those who have left the service, they walked away with an appreciation of what public service is all about, why it matters, and why this is so critical to get it right. Because by and large, the reason why these functions are delegated to the public sector is because no one else can do it. Usually that's the case. It takes that kind of focus of a public entity in order to achieve an outcome that frankly would not be achieved in other spheres. So as a result of that, it gave me an incredibly in-depth understanding of that process at a very early stage in my career that has lasted the entirety of that professional experience.
A closing question: who has influenced your leadership style, and what about their example stays with you? And that question can be cast broadly. So, inside government, outside government, perhaps not government at all, somebody that you've met, reported to, been mentored by, a broad net. But when you think about broadly, when you think about who has influenced you, who comes to mind?
I would have to say that the number one, hands down, greatest influence during the course of my life was my dad. He was an engineer, so everything was a calculated risk. I think I was probably 25 before I realized the answer was not to be found for everything in a slide rule, but that was his bent and his mindset. And he taught me how to think critically. And it really was one of the most extraordinary attributes. And he was an inspiring parent and mentor in so many ways. And all the different things I've done throughout the course of his life, I had the opportunity through much of it to be able to consult with him on a variety of things, and always walked away with a more informed perspective. Dad was an extraordinary public servant in his own right.
Well, Sean, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences. It has been a pleasure talking.
I'm delighted to be with you, Shane. Thank you so much for doing this.
And this is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until the next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.